Thank you very much, and welcome everyone from my side. My name is Fabian Burkhardt, and I'm working at the IEA as an electricity annual manager, and I will give you today a brief overview about electricity and heat. Without further ado, let's start with the outline. I will talk about the recent trends in electricity, followed by some key concepts in relation to electricity statistics. And of course, in the end, we'll have time for some questions. So let's start and dive into the electricity trends. Here you can see the evolution of world electricity production between 1974, when the IEA was founded, and 2022. Over this period, the world electricity production increased year upon year, with the exception of 2009 and another dip later on during the COVID crisis. Overall, this resulted in an almost fourfold increase in electricity production from roughly 6,300 terawatt hours in 1974 to almost 30,000 terawatt hours in 2022. Let's start with a small quiz where you can also answer in Menti. What is the main fuel used for electricity production in the world in 2022? For this, I invite you to go to Menti with the code 49411893 to answer this question. We have touched upon this topic already in some other presentations, I think also in the previous presentation I was part of. And now I invite you to see what you have learned. What is the main fuel used for electricity production in the world in 2020-22? Natural gas, oil, solar and wind, coal, hydro, or biofuels? I can see many answers coming in. Most are in favor of coal. There's also an answer for natural gas and hydro. The big majority thinks that coal was the main fuel used for electricity generation in 2022. I think we have a clear winner. It is coal. You can still start voting, but coal is the correct answer. Still in 2022. Okay, so over this 50-year period almost, since 1974, the mix of fuels used to generate electricity changed. For instance, if we look at the share of electricity production from oil, it is shaded in dark blue. You will see that oil has fallen from about 25% of production in 1974 to around 3% now in 2022. Similarly, the share of hydro has fallen from about 23% to 17%, as many of the suitable large-scale sites have already been damped. And by contrast, the share of production from natural gas, shaded in light blue, has increased significantly, rising from about 12% to almost 24% of generation. There's also been a noticeable increase in production from nuclear power, with the share rising from 4% in 1974 to 13% in 2010. However, since then, the share has declined slightly, in particular following the accident at Fukushima nuclear plant in 2011. During this time, you will notice that coal still remains the main fuel used for power generation, as we found out before, with its share changing little between 1974 and 2020. One of the reasons for coal's enduring popularity is still its cost advantages over other fuels. However, on the emissions front, there's some good news. If you look at the share of electricity output from solar and wind, which is shaded in yellow and light green, you will see that although from the output from these renewable sources is still relatively small, their share has been steadily increasing in recent years as production costs have fallen. So in summary, compared with 1974, the electricity mix has a lower share of oil and hydro, a higher share of natural gas, nuclear, and solar and wind. The share of coal is still approximately constant. Now let's look at the data for electricity generation in 2022. As mentioned, coal is the dominant fuel, followed by natural gas, which provides just on a quarter of total output. In total, almost 2/3 of all electricity production comes from combustible fuels, so coal, oil, gas, biofuels, waste. With the remaining third is produced by non-emitting sources such as nuclear, hydro, solar, wind, but also geothermal. As mentioned, the share from solar and wind is still relatively small, has been steadily growing over the recent years, with the combined share of wind now over 3 times that of oil. Now let's look at the electricity production by region. Here you can see a graph of electricity production for the OECD and non-OECD countries. OECD is the dark line, the black line, and all the other countries are shaped here in different colors. As you can see, electricity production in non-OECD countries has grown much faster than in OECD countries over the past 20 years. As a result, production in non-OECD countries surpassed that of OECD countries in 2011. Since then, the electricity production in non-OECD countries has continued to increase, while production in OECD countries has plateaued almost. As of 2020, non-OECD countries' share of production stands at around 60% compared with 28% in 1974. It's a similar graph, just with a line for the non-OECD countries here to be seen in red. However, we have to mention that also within the non-OECD countries, trends differ by region. If we disaggregate non-OECD production by region, we can see that much of the growth in recent years has been driven by China and other countries in non-OECD Asia. Now, let's look at the electricity consumption by sector. Firstly, you will notice that consumption has increased fourfold. We've mentioned that between 1974 and 2022, growing from 5,000 terawatt hours to almost 30,000 terawatt hours. If you remember a few slides back, we have seen that production has also increased fourfold, so it makes sense that consumption would increase by a similar amount. However, the numbers are different. If you remember from the production graph, production was almost 30,000 terawatt hours. And here you can see it's 25,000 terawatt hours, not as I've been mentioning 30,000. The reason for that is the transmission and distribution losses and also the energy industry own use. Looking at the consumption sector, the industry is the largest consuming sector. However, its share of consumption has declined over time as restructuring and improvements in energy efficiency, in particular in OECD countries, has seen electricity demand in industry rise at a lower rate than in other sectors. However, this is a graph for the world, and you will see on the next slide consumption patterns in OECD and non-OECD differ. So, if we compare the sectoral consumption in the OECD on the left-hand side with the non-OECD countries on the right, we can see that there are some differences. In the OECD, 3 sectors, industry, residential, and commercial and public services sector, each consume roughly around a third, 30 to 32% of the electricity demand. By contrast, in the non-OECD countries as a whole, industry represents almost half of the total electricity demand. There are many reasons for these differences: the structure of the respective economies, income levels, and others. However, of course, again, trends differ at an individual country level. So that's it from the small history and the trends. Let's start with the concepts. Firstly, let's look at the sources of electricity. Electricity is produced as both primary and secondary energy. Primary electricity is obtained from natural sources such as hydro, solar, photovoltaic, and others. Secondary electricity is obtained from the heat generated by burning combustible fuels, from geothermal heat, solar thermal heat. Similarly, also heat can be used as primary and secondary energy. Primary heat is obtained from natural sources such as solar thermal, geothermal, as well as from fission in nuclear reactors. Secondary heat is obtained by burning combustible fuels and from transforming electricity into heat in electric boilers, or by capturing it from low temperature sources using heat pumps, for instance. Now, let's look at the producers. Electricity and heat producers can be divided into two broad categories: main activity producers and order producers. Main activity producers generate electricity and heat for third parties as the primary activity. The main purpose of the facility is to generate electricity or heat. For instance, a nuclear power plant is a good example of a main activity producer. By contrast, order producers generate electricity or heat only as a secondary activity in support of the primary activity. For instance, a large chemical manufacturing facility may have an on-site power plant to generate electricity and heat, which is used in the production process. Some of this electricity and heat may also be sold. However, the main purpose of the facility is to produce chemicals, not to produce the electricity and heat. Therefore, this would be classified as an order producer. Now, let's look at the plant types. Electricity and heat producers can be further distinguished by the type of plant that is operating. There are three categories: electricity-only plants, which, as the name suggests, only produce electricity; heat-only plants, again, which the name suggests, only produce heat; and combined heat and power plants, or also named CHP plants, which can generate both electricity and heat in a combined process. This is also known as cogeneration. Some more reporting conventions now used in the reporting of electricity and heat statistics. For main activity producers, the convention is very simple. All production of electricity and heat is reported. However, for oil producers, there are some specific conventions for heat. This is because oil producers are also industrial consumers that use fuel to power their processes. For oil producers, all electricity is produced in the electricity and heat questionnaire. However, only the amounts of heat sold are reported. Amounts of heat generated for own use on-site are not reported. Similarly, when reporting the associated fuel inputs to electricity and heat production, for heat, only the amounts of fuel input associated with heats sold are reported. A small note on that one: for the new annual questionnaire, auto-consumed heat by auto producer CHP can now be collected. Another important concept that I want to mention is the distinction between gross and net production. Gross production refers to the total output of electricity or heat generated in a facility before any is used. However, not all of this is used for productive purposes beyond the power plant. Some of the electricity and heat that is generated is used on-site at the power plant, for lighting, heating, or to support simply plant operations. This is referred to as own use. The remainder that is left over after subtracting the own use is the net production. However, remember that for all producers, production only refers to heat sold. Which brings me already to the next concept, the convention for reporting of own use data. If you may recall, for all producers, we only report the amount of heat sold, not the total heat production. Therefore, we cannot report the total amount of heat used for own use, as this would not align with the reported production figures. So we need to make an assumption. For main activity producers and for all production of electricity, the situation is simple. Net production is equal to gross production minus own use, as was just described on the previous slide. However, for auto production of heat, we assume that gross production is equal to net production and there is no own use. This is because for auto production of heat, it's difficult to distinguish between heat used for own use and that used, which is simply used for plant operations. I hope this was clear. Also here on the slide again, to recap, for heat produced by all producers, there are slightly different reporting conventions. We only report heat sold, and we assume that gross equals net. Now that we have covered, I think, the tricky part of the presentation, let's move on to the electricity and heat supply chain and some of the data that we collect in our questionnaire. In terms of supply, we collect fuel inputs to electricity and heat generation, gross production, own use, net production. In addition, we also collect the data on electricity used for pumped storage hydro and for electric boilers and heat pumps where the heat output is sold. And finally, on the supply side, we also collect data on trade. So with this data, you have the supply side of the electricity balance. In between the supply and consumption, the electricity travels along cables where some losses occur, and these data is also collected in the questionnaire. And finally, we have the end users, so we collect data on consumption across the consuming sectors such as industry, transport, residential. So in theory, the difference between supply and final consumption figures should just be losses. However, sometimes in reality, there may also be some statistical differences. And finally, we also collect data such as peak load and capacity data, which can be useful for some other electricity analysis. Yeah, in the last slide, we have seen that losses are the main difference between supply and consumption figures. So just to give you a little more detail on the magnitude of the losses that can be expected and why they occur. As electricity travels through cables and transformers, energy is lost along the way. Much of this is in form of heat, as the electric current flowing through the cable raises its temperature. This energy is lost as it dissipates into the surroundings, reducing the amount of energy that reaches, in the end, the final destination. In general, losses can be expected to be in a range of around 5 to 50%, depending on the country, depending on infrastructure. With losses on the lower end of the scale observed in more advanced, compact, and well-maintained grids, and higher losses observed in older and more distributed grids, where there's a higher rate of meter bypassing, such as theft. Globally, transmission and distribution losses represent around 7% of the total gross production, and energy industry own use represents around further 9%. So in total, around 16% of the total gross production, a sizable amount, in my opinion, is lost or used outside of the final consuming sectors. Here you can see the figures for 2021. As you can see, gross production amounted to almost 30,000 terawatt hours, while final consumption amounted to under 25,000 terawatt hours. Let's look at another important concept and also a useful check related to the electricity supply, which is generation efficiency. I think we've talked a lot about efficiency. Here a bit more in detail about the efficiency for electricity and heat. It is calculated as the total gross energy produced by a plant divided by the energy content of the fuel used to produce it. So again, energy out divided by energy in. According to the first law of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created or destroyed. Therefore, the efficiency must be less than 100%. The expected efficiency will vary depending on the fuel and technology. For instance, the combined cycle gas turbines would be expected to be more efficient than simple coal power plants. The efficiency must be calculated using energy units, and you must use the same units for inputs and outputs. And for this example here, we have 20 units of electricity generated plus 45 units of heat generated divided by 100 units of input, which ends up to an efficiency of 65%. The other 35 units of energy, simply lost to the environment as waste heat. So efficiency can be a useful check for electricity statistics. We can use our knowledge of expected or historic efficiency values to check if the reported inputs and outputs for plants make sense. Moving on to another reporting convention for trade. Unlike with other fuels, and this is really unique here, trade of electricity and heat is reported on the basis of borders crossed, not origin and destination. In addition, reported imports and exports include amounts in transit. So for example, if Portugal was to export electricity to France through Spain, then as France and Portugal do not share a common border, they would not report trade with each other, but with Spain. So Portugal would report exports to Spain in this example. Spain would report imports from Portugal and export to France. And finally, France would only report imports from Spain. So Portugal and France would not report trade with each other. This differs from the conventions used for other fuels. One more small concept in electricity statistics that is useful to be aware of, and that is the difference between energy and power. Simply put, power is the rate at which energy is used. So power is simply energy divided by time. Power is measured in watts, and energy is measured in joules. However, the numbers for joules become quite soon very high. That's why we usually use watt hours in the energy world to refer to energy. So this is an important distinction. Again, watt refers to power and watt hours to energy. In addition to production, consumption, and trade data, the electricity questionnaire also captures data on power plant capacities, specifically net maximum capacities. Net maximum capacity is simply the maximum power output that a power plant can produce with all plants, with all units running at full blast on the 31st of December of the reporting year. These are very useful data for analysts to have. However, they can also be useful for statisticians when checking the data, as we can compare actually reported production values with the maximum potential production values. So we can check if the data makes sense. With this value, actual production divided by potential production is called the capacity factor. Again, it should be less than 100%, except if there were plant closures near the end of the year, in which case the figures may be distorted. And there are also different expected values depending on technology. For instance, nuclear plants are expensive to build and therefore typically run as much as possible. Whereas solar PV, which does not run at night and is both weather and location dependent, will have a bit of a lower capacity factor. So as statisticians, we can use both historical and expected capacity factors to check data. Just a few comments on the data collection, and then I will almost close the presentation and open the floor for questions. With all statistics, data collection has costs in terms of time and money, but also in terms of opportunity costs. Therefore, a balance must be struck between available resources and needs. This said, it should be kept in mind that not having the proper information available for informed decision-making can lead to higher costs. In terms of specific challenges now for electricity statistics, the liberalization of electricity markets has had a big impact. Previously, there were monopolies. All the electricity data could be gathered from one company, but now data needs to be gathered from many different companies, some big, some small. In addition, competition leads also to companies to be reluctant to provide data and to confidentiality issues. So this can impact data coverage and comprehensiveness. Okay, and with this, I will close my presentation and open the floor for any questions.
Thanks a lot, Jan. Really nice presentation. There are one comment and one question in the chat. Can you have a look and comment on those?
Mhm.
Thank you.
Okay, so you only have pumped hydro as storage. Will you not soon have to accommodate other storage solutions? In fact, we have recently, so last year, embedded also batteries with another table for mainly short-term storage solutions. So we also accommodate at the moment other storage solutions, yeah, mainly batteries. So we will probably already capture yeah, the big chunk of storage possibilities that are currently out there with the pumped hydro storage and batteries. That is very recent and is not yet mandatory for countries to report that. Okay, and then there's another one, not to be picky, but there's also tree generation, cold with solid oxide fuel cell. Of course, combined heat and power plants can consist of different units, and the different units can produce different outputs. So at the moment, we are also talking about district cooling. However, this is not yet captured in the questionnaire itself. Um, there are currently discussions about that, how to capture it, how to report that. Um, However, at the moment, the generation output that we capture is limited to heat and electricity. All other forms, especially cold for district cooling and other purposes, are currently not yet captured, no matter the technology.